r/AskReddit. Psychologists of Reddit, have you ever been genuinely scared by a patient before? What's your story? Not a psychologist, but I used to have to escort jail inmates to sessions and sit in for them. They manipulate the living shit out of healthcare workers, and I was legally not permitted to say a word about it during sessions. They'd scam for meds, try to get all sorts of legal favors, lie their asses off, and generally treated it like a vacation or field trip. In one instance, a guy who had been previously convicted for rape of a minor under 2 and who had also done prison time for stealing urns from a cemetery, dumping the ashes out in a dumpster, and selling them for scrap metal had this shrink tearing up with his fake life story and agreeing to prescribe him a ton of different meds he really didn't need and write a strongly worded letter to the district attorney in his favor. After the shrink did so, it ended up not mattering, because he was given an additional charge for brutally raping another inmate, who was wheelchair bound. I recall the shrink, almost distraught, remarking to me that she couldn't believe such a nice guy would ever do that. I just responded that the guys I bring her aren't in full restraints on accident, and that I'm lethally armed and armored during such escorts, to protect her from them more than anything. I think that mental health care staff are good-natured and want to help, but naive as shit, and are routinely scammed by scumbags. I also think that they tend to be a bit pompous, and it gives them blind spots, like a sorta "I'm too smart to ever be taken for a ride by my patients" mentality. Overall, I think they do a lot of good, but I think that they need to realize some of their patients more than deserve everything that's happening to them, and are not worth talking to at all. Not a psychologist, but mine told me something kind of fucked 2 years ago. I was seeing her, and she helped me to see that my boyfriend was very abusive, and I credit her with being able to escape that relationship. I didn't see her for a long time after that, but got back in touch with her a couple months ago. After a few sessions, she said she wanted to tell me something that she absolutely shouldn't tell me, so I was obviously intrigued. Apparently, a few weeks after our last session 2 years ago, a man made a first-time appointment. He walked in and immediately gave her the creeps. She said he stood too close and towered over her. He was clearly trying to be charming, but had the pungent vibe of a true narcissist. As they talked, he was condescending and smug. He started talking about how his relationship had ended because his ex was crazy and unrealistic, but that he would take her back if she started acting right. As he gave more details about his ex, her stomach dropped because she realized he was talking about me. Knowing all the shit he did to me and recognizing his narcissistic personality, she was freaked. She said he was clearly trying to discredit me to my own therapist so that I might be cut off from my main support. She said that isn't uncommon, but she's never felt so completely chilled by someone's presence before. She sought advice from her supervisor and was going to call him out at their next appointment and tell him she wouldn't see him anymore, but he didn't show and never contacted her again. That guy put me through hell, and it was honestly so validating that my psychologist got to see his shit personality for herself. Licensed counselor here. When I was interning in an outpatient dual diagnosis facility, I had a run-in with a person that had come to our program about 3 months out of prison with impulsive behavior issues prone to violent outbursts, but it was typically verbal aggression in my experience with them. They threatened another client, which was grounds for immediate discharge from the program, but they left before we could tell them so. We notified police and locked the front door in case they decided to come back, as they had also threatened a mother and her young kid outside while waiting for their ride. So I go to the bathroom, which is down the hall from it, offices in a big medical office building, and on the way back I hear this person coming down the stairs singing agitated, and God, they are going to give my supervisor a piece of their mind and maybe something else. The stairs are between me and it offices, so shit. I call out to them because we had been working together and had some rapport, thinking I'd get the other client a head start so they don't mind their scheduled appointment and get locked out with us in the hallway. I try to calm the person down, and they are not having it and super-if down the hallway after about 5 minutes, not heeding my advice. to take a walk or cool down first. I even offered to walk with them to no avail. They get to the door and it's locked. They round on me and demand I open the door. I told them we didn't feel safe with them in the office and the door would remain locked. The person gets inches from my face, telling and swearing, but no threats. I somehow remain calm and reiterate it would be a good idea to take a walk. They then made a vague threat about if we had met on the street, this would have gone differently and stormed off. It wasn't until I made it back to my desk and took a breath that I realized how terribly that could have gone. I had no backup, alone in a basement. Our offices were the only ones on that floor, with an agitated person prone to violence. I will never forget that experience. I work in a hospital now with impulsive and violent patients all the time, but there are always at least 3 people on hand to help if needed. That was the most unsafe I have ever been on the job. Not a psychologist, but I used to work in a psych ward as security. We had this huge guy with schizophrenia detained in ones, which is the ward for those who have been legally determined to be unfit and are not allowed to leave. When I say huge, I mean he was like 6'5", gigantic muscles, and he used to be an MMA fighter. Real nice guy when medicated, but when in psychosis, he was not someone you'd want to go toe to toe with. We would sometimes have to call police to help us deal with him. One officer would arrive, take a look at him, and go nope, and call for backup. So one day I was guarding the entrance to ones. He was doing fairly okay, so he wasn't confined to his room and was allowed to walk around the supervised communal space. He puts down his magazine, goes into his room, and then walks out naked. Dude walks up to me, stands about an inch away, and looks down at me. I mean way down, as I'm only 5'3". He tells me he's leaving. I asked if he would like some shoes or a gown. He says no, he's leaving and I better step aside. So I did. You better believe I stepped the fuck aside and let him walk out. I followed him at a safe distance through the psych ward, where everyone basically pinned themselves against the wall to get away, and out into the parking lot while on the call with the cops. I can't leave the ground, so once he was off hospital property, I could only inform the police to which way he was running, which was down into a heavily populated downtown core. Not even 15 minutes later, he comes back and walks back into the lobby of the ward and asks for me. He wants shoes after all. Not a robe, but shoes. So I bring him shoes to prevent him from getting violent, and off he goes again as I repeat the process, following him to the edge of the grounds and calling the cops. Cops bring him back and put him into his secure room. However, once he is in there, they are not allowed to restrain past a certain point. So the whole security team assembles, which is me and about 5 men. They decide I'm to hold a leg as I'm small and legs are easier to restrain. So we go into the room in a triangle formation with me as the last to enter. He must have missed when I came in the door, because he started screaming that I was a shapeshifter and freaking out. It took us about 30 minutes of restraining him before he was medicated enough to calm down. Fast forward maybe 2 years later. I'm no longer security or live in the town, but I went for a metal show. I joked to friends that I was worried someone I had dealt with in the hospital might recognize me and have bad memories. Lo and behold, there is MMA fighter taking shots at the bar. Now I know that he shouldn't be drinking with his meds, but hey, it's been 2 years and I don't know anything about his current health status, so whatever. I still tried to avoid him in case he remembered my shape-shifting. At one point our lines to the bar coincided, and I ended up standing next to him. He looked up at me, looked down, and then looked back up and stared hard. I could tell he recognized me, but I could also tell that he was trying to figure out from where. The entire night I could see him lingering around me, staring with this befuddled expression on his face. I was a tad scared. Clinical psychologist here. I used to work in a prison and did a parole evaluation for an inmate that was a high-ranking gang member in a national gang. By his account, he was the highest ranking in the state. In fact, he was placed in that prison to hold his people accountable and keep the peace. He had a long violent record and was, in my opinion, a genuine psychopath. part of the Evil is discussing the crime and assessing remorse and whatnot. He was so clinical in his description of how he tortured and left this guy to die over an unpaid debt. Live by the sword, die by the sword was his phraseology for the act, like it was nothing. He was also very nonchalant about his ability to take care of his business while inside. I believed him. He had only spent 18 months of his last 15 years outside of prison. My recommendation was not to parole him. There were various factors that I gave, and in the end the parole board went with my recommendation. So the part that actually scared me, this was my first parole level, was this guy's ability to affect the world outside. He could have sent someone to my house if he wanted to. I had no doubt about that. More experienced psychologists told me not to worry about it, that he knew the score and wouldn't take it personally. I had a hard time buying it. I was running a long-term offender group a few months later, and he was part of it. After the first group I pulled him aside and asked if we were good. He smiled at me and told me not to worry. I did my job and he didn't blame me for writing what I did because it was true. He went on to be a really insightful and active group member. When I was studying psychology my final year, I had the opportunity to meet with convicted felons. Essentially, I sat down and spoke to a man in his 30s who was a sexual offender. He told me he used to marry women and then rape their young daughters. Each was in the range of 6 to 7 years old. I listened to him explain it. It was literally my instructions not to judge them. I had to sign a waiver to not get emotional. So I asked him about the home life of those he abused. He'd say that some of the women he married had other children, and in one case there was an older sister who was 13, but he would never ever touch her. He'd drop her off at school, where he told me he was never into any of the children he saw, and take her to practice in friend's house, and while she was gone, he'd go back and rape her 6-year-old sister. He told me that it really isn't always about being attracted to prepubescent girls, it's about the dominance and power that come with having sex with them. He's being rehabilitated now though. Weird part was that I wasn't sure if he was acting remorseful. BC if he was, he is amazing at it. He was just very open to my questions and expressed regret and I almost believed him. However, when I met a man who was convicted of child porn, his I feel terrible-s were transparent and so full of shit it was disgusting. My professors warned me about manipulation, so that was easy to catch on to, but with the previous guy, he was either an impeccable liar and manipulator, or he genuinely wanted to get better. Crazy. My brother-in-law is low-functioning autistic and blind. At one point his care provider who had worked with him for years and knew him quite well got into a very dangerous situation with him. She had worked with him since he was smaller and had become experienced at interacting safely when he would become angry and aggressive. They had found a good balance of medication for him and she let her guard down. This time though, he was now 20 years old and 6 foot tall. In a split second, he attacked her, jumping up from the couch directly across from her chair. He was very strong and viciously aggressive. I have found myself in tough situations with him, and I'm 6 feet 4 inches 225 lbs. After receiving quite a few blows from his hands, hair torn out, and bites on her arms and hands, she was able to push away across the ground and get behind the couch he had been sitting on. She quickly slid the couch into a corner so that he wouldn't have a way around it easily, and she hid herself behind it and tried to be very quiet. He searched that corner of the room for over an hour, following the front and side edges of the couch with his hands, back and forth pacing, until he eventually lost interest and went to play with some toys off in the corner of the room. She got out of the corner and ran for her door, just as her assistant was coming to remind her that she had gone over the allotted time. My Bill is an amazing guy, and I've had some awesome experiences with him over the years, but the idea of being hunted by sound like that is pretty freaky. Good friend of mine's wife is a psychologist at a well-known prison and sees some seriously fucked up people for a living. Let's just say, Hannibal inspired her to do what she does for a living and she's as close to Clarice as a person can probably get in real life. She is usually briefed on relevant details before she is assigned to a case. This includes court proceedings, testimonies, etc. She's heard recordings of murders and other such disturbing shit. She's tough as nails and I guess she loves psychoanalyzing scary psychos. She had to be taken off a case because she was so uneasy, disturbed, and threatened by one of her clients. Apparently this guy was either a serial rapist or murderer. She couldn't give lots of details, but he has a victim profile and she fit it. He started to behave strangely towards her, trying to converse with her and get to know her. He would write her letters and draw her pictures and attempt to give her tokens and things. All the things he would do to his victims. Well, everything possible under the circumstances. She was so upset and disturbed by his special attention that she was even afraid at the grocery store and started to feel uneasy in her home at night. Despite the fact that this guy was locked up in a maximum security prison. She described it like a hunter/prey vibe on a really weird animalistic level. She was taken off his case and received counseling. When she told me about it, she was very honest and matter of fact. This is a hazard of the job she works. While she may talk about her patients as if they are lab rats, this was one case you could tell really got under her skin and spooked her. Edit. Obviously giving tokens and letters is not only creepy, but violates the doctor-patient relationship. She would decline very firmly and clearly, and I guess maybe some stuff was intercepted before he had the chance to try and actually give it to her. It's been about 10 years since I heard the story, but it stuck with me. Obligatory, not a psychologist, but I used to work as an aide in a special education classroom in a middle school. The year I started, a majority of my workload was 8th grade boys and 2 of them had deeply troubling behavioral issues. One kid assaulted a girl in his class. At school, in front, is a bunch of other kids. He actually got arrested for it, but the school couldn't expel him because of his disability. For the rest of the year, he was forbidden from being anywhere, including the lunchroom, with her. I spent a lot of time essentially babysitting this kid. And because he didn't give a fuck about school, he did practically nothing during his time in the resource room. The last I heard, he'd been arrested again for breaking into someone's house and stealing a handgun. But the one who scared me was completely antisocial, to the point of threatening to hurt himself or others when a field trip or school assembly was coming up. We eventually had to tell his parents in advance so they wouldn't bring him to school. He talked about death constantly, all while extremely medicated, so it was a very muted, mumbled, and done through a 1,000-yard stare with spittle coming from his mouth. One of the teachers was pregnant. She wasn't his teacher, but he knew who she was, and one day he asked me would Mrs. X's baby live if someone ran her over in a car. I told him I didn't know, and tried to change the subject. Then he asked what if someone cut her stomach open? What if they stabbed her? What if she had been dead for a while and no one found her? This really freaked me out, and I had to report it to the SPED teacher. When I told her, she said he had asked her and other students the same thing and scared the shit out of them. She said the pregnant teacher had been advised to avoid him in case he did or said anything to upset her. I'm a farm worker. The grandson of the guy I worked for was off the charts crazy. The grandparents couldn't control him. They bought him a .22 rifle. It had a trigger lock. They gave him the key and some ammunition. I locked it away. Because he was 6 years old, he threatened to shoot me, so I put him in timeout. He shit on the floor and laughed like a crazy asshole. I came to find out it was his sister's rifle I took away, because a few hours later he came outside with his rifle trigger lock off bolt-in and ammunition in his pocket to kill me for taking away his sister's gun. Every day I had to deal with something like this. I have seen other workers chasing this 6-year-old kid with hammers. He was batshit crazy. I have many stories about that. Year I warned him to stop playing on the roof of a tractor, he would get hurt, and I'm not there to watch that bullshit. He starts to get down and just seemed to flop down on purpose. Landed stomach first on the back of the tractor. It would have hurt so bad. He cried for about 20 seconds, then cackled with laughter. He probably broke ribs, and I saw massive bruises on his stomach when he lifted his shirt to check for cuts. I watched him kill baby chickens by first saying, "How cute," and petting them, then standing on them. He tortured a farm dog to the point it growled when he went near, and one point I actually had to stop the dog from killing him. It had him by the back of the neck and was chomping down. He was crying, then burst into laughter. I can't speak enough about this kid to convey the frustration he would cause. He scared me, and I was on a farm where aggressive black Angus bulls were a daily thing. Everyone hated that kid, and I'm relieved I'm not around him anymore. Here's coming your way, psychologists. Not a psych, but I worked with paralyses for a while as my first job. There was one guy that still sends shivers up my spine whenever I think about him. He came in straight from court, and sometimes we didn't receive the details of the offenses before we met with them. This was one of those times. I called him into the office and started going through his paperwork, rules and restrictions of his order, how often he had to report, etc. He started requesting a male officer and stated that he hated females and got along better with men because they understood him. At this point, I still didn't know what he had done to be on parole, and he did not want to disclose anything. He spent about 30 minutes talking about how he was the victim of the crime and that females had it out for him. He was very hostile and kept looking at me with a disgusted look and sat with his arms crossed. The paperwork finally came through about an hour into the meeting. He was on for some very serious and disgusting offenses against females. I then let him know that I had received the paperwork and asked him to discuss what had happened. We were asked to get their version of events. It was like something switched, and he suddenly became very happy and almost proud of what he had done. He kept standing up and acting out what he had done in detail while smiling the whole time and asking me what I thought of it all. Without going into detail about his offenses, it was very graphic and hard to hear, and the fact that he appeared to be so proud of it was just chilling. He also kept asking whether I thought he was the victim of the crime, and at one point asked me if I had any contact numbers for victim compensation for himself. Towards the end of the meeting, he was trying to charm me and kept asking me what time I was finishing work and whether I was parked nearby. I left with a group of my colleagues that day. He ended up back in jail about a month later, and while I'm all for rehabilitation of offenders, I sincerely hope he stays in there. During my internship, worked under a psychiatrist who often referred their practice clients to our locked unit. They had one who, their words, claimed multiple personalities and kept detailed biographical records for each in journals. The patient visited the unit frequently but calm, organized, and even relaxed, and that shaped my entire young understanding of dissociative identity disorder. I believed it as far as my ethical obligation to consider the diagnosis, but didn't think I would ever see anything clinically supportive of it. Fast forward months later, and I'm the only clinician on the unit catching up admissions assessments. If family was present, we took their version of patient history as a usually helpful reference to help us better understand their needs. The spouse of this new patient mentioned they were like two different people. I assumed it was descriptive in their way of articulating a vast difference between asymptomatic and symptomatic behaviors. Regretfully, I didn't ask too many follow-ups, but they did keep insisting it was like living with multiple people. Once the client and I were alone, I did the usual standard assessment. Some people are uncomfortable with it, but most don't seem to find it too troubling, unless they're very guarded, not wanting to share, protective of their story or information. This client began to get agitated and a little snippy. I tried to de-escalate, but before the words left my mouth, everything about this human changed in front of my eyes. Their entire face melted into a new position. It was as if their muscles rearranged themselves on a different skull. Posture changed, energy changed, and I got goosebumps as it was happening in real time. Probably less than a minute later, a slow smile spread across their face. They answered my questions with a different sounding voice and apologized for the delay. My stomach almost did a flip. It was absolutely unsettling. I rushed to the end of the assessment so the nurses could do their thing and just sat in my office processing for a good half hour. I had never witnessed it before and have not seen anything close since that day. I was all excited to tell the psych doc what I had witnessed, and they blew it off, overrode my assessment diagnosis, and slapped bipolar on the treatment plan. That being said, I do now fully believe, but also consider it to be exceedingly rare. I'm a psychologist now, but between undergraduate and graduate school, I worked at this facility with male teenage sex offenders for about 2 years. It was the single worst period of my entire life. When I started, I generally had faith in the staff, and I really wanted to help the kids. It probably wasn't 6 weeks in before all of the stress got to me. The kids knew that most of the rules were enforceable, and they could constantly curse at us, threaten us, steal, break rules, manipulate the system, and act out with very few repercussions. I think it was my second day there when I saw a kid break down a steel door with a chair. They would provoke staff. They would provoke each other so they could force staff to intervene and try to get the staff in harm's way. What's worse, I'm a bit of a straightforward and by the book guy, and the kids started to learn that I would enforce the rules, and they started to hate me and target me. I began to have chest pain on the drive to work. I would have trouble falling asleep at night because I would be imagining the threats and restraints the next day that I might be involved in. It does bad things to your psyche when someone can criticize you, make false allegations against you, just to get you in trouble, lie to you, demean you, and threaten you for months on end, and you essentially can't defend yourself because you're constrained by your role. You can't hit them back, talk back, show attitude, and the only tiles you can enforce, or privileges you can take away, the kids could give a shit about. Meanwhile, you are giving them your everything. Basic hygiene, school help, counseling, playing games, talking them through life issues, putting them to bed at night. You're essentially their parent. But to answer your questions, yeah, I was afraid of several of them. I was assaulted 3 times while I worked there. 2 of the assaults were relatively minor, just a single punch to the chest or a single punch to the face, but one of the kids punched me 6 or 7 times in the head. One of the kids who was HIV positive, anytime he would be mad or get in trouble, he would guilt us that he was going to die of AIDS one day, and then he would threaten to cut himself and then get his blood on us. We had lots of gang members too. They were all highly volatile. Thank you so much for watching the whole video. Please leave a like and subscribe.